Hello and welcome to another Parallel Project Training podcast. This is a podcast on the new APM PMQ syllabus that's launching in September 2024. My name's Ruth Phillips and I'm here with Carmen Campos, who's one of Parallel's senior trainers. Good morning, Carmen.
Good morning.
So today's topic is stakeholder engagement and communication management. Really, really important. A lot of really good stuff within this learning objective. There's quite a lot of learning outcomes named on the syllabus here. So let's take them one by one. First of all, before we dive into the depth of stakeholder engagement and communication management, let's rewind a little bit and make sure we understand what actually is a project stakeholder. What does that term mean?
So a stakeholder is anyone, individual or group, with an interest or role over the project. So in other words, it could be anyone that may be affected by the project or could affect your project. And
Right.
the PMs will have to work with stakeholders internally and externally to achieve the project objectives.
Okay, I think that last bit that you said there is really important because I think that a lot of people think about stakeholders as purely external to the project, but they're also people within the project as well, aren't they?
Exactly. And as the criteria says, stakeholders need engagement. So we need to actively manage them to try to get them to the point where they're rather supportive than not.
I think it's a really important topic. We'll talk more about the benefits of and the importance of managing stakeholders across the project life cycle, but it's important to understand how they contribute to the success of the project. Right, okay, so we've understood what a project stakeholder is, both people internally and externally to the project that have got an interest or influence over the project. How do we go about identifying who our stakeholders are for a particular project?
So it depends. If you are in a very well understood organization, you have been there for many years, you have done similar projects before, and you may already know who they are. But let's suppose you start a new project, completely new, and you need to do this from scratch. First thing you would do, you talk to your sponsor, have conversations with team members, probably go to the organizational charts, doing some research, maybe looking at previous projects, and even just going on things like social medias, communities. So there is no right or wrong way to do it. What is important really is to identify who are these key stakeholders, and this is where the analysis helps you.
I quite often say that when we're identifying stakeholders that there's the usual suspects and then there's also another group of people that we've got to tease out the stakeholders that are for this specific project as well. And I think it's really important that the project manager doesn't do this on their own, as you said, that they involve the sponsor, the team, get their understanding as to who the stakeholders are going to be.
That's right. The more people you talk, the better.
Definitely. So our first learning outcome then is to understand the relationship between stakeholder analysis, influence and engagement. So we've identified who our stakeholders are. What's this stakeholder analysis? What do we do for that?
So in this criteria, what we're going to do is we're going to look at how the stakeholder analysis plays a role in deciding the way we influence and engage them. So to do that, we could start assessing all the various stakeholders in terms of their power and interest. Some people also classify them in terms of whether they have a negative or positive attitude towards the project. And I know that it's a bit subjective, isn't it? Because how do you see whether someone is high power or not? Power is not only about seniority or about the band or about the level of authority. Some people could be really influential just because the amount of things they know, maybe about how well that person is networked. Everyone has that person in the business that everyone likes. It's been many years in the organization and knows everything, knows all the tricks.
I quite often refer to that person as a nodal manager. So they're not necessarily, as you said, a line manager or very senior in the hierarchy, but they're well networked. Understanding who those people are is important because they can spread a lot of opposition to a project if they're not happy about it, or they can actually be really important in advocating for a project as well. And you can quite often get a lot of underlying support from them if you get things right.
That's right. So understanding the relative power, the influence they could have. how interested they are on the project. We said in the definition is people that is affected by the project or could affect the project. So if someone is really affected by the project, could be really interested, but they could be against the project. Not everyone is pro project. So for example, if you're building a new road, if you're building a new airport in an area, some neighbors may be really against the project and could really be blockers. So this analysis will really help you to understand what engagement you need and how to better engage them.
I really enjoy doing this actually, and I think it's a really nice way of getting the project team together to talk and discuss this. And quite often I use a grid to record the power and the interest on different axes, and I quite often colour if it's negative as opposed to positive, so you can see it all on one page, and it's really nice and visual when I do that. So it's a really valuable step to do.
But at the same time, you need to be very, very careful. There will be some conversations that are probably just do it like on a one-to-one, because no one wants to be there in a meeting being said, oh, you are low power, low interest to us. I personally find it really difficult. First, where do you put people in a grid? And also, people may have different opinion to what you think. You may think, well, it's not very important, but the individual may say, actually, I really want to be engaged. I really want to know what happens. So I always find this a very, very difficult exercise.
What does the grid then tell us? So when we see that, for example, we've got somebody who is high power, high interest, and maybe a negative attitude to the project, what should that tell us? What action should we take based on that analysis?
So in that example, very, very active engagement. You don't want them to derail the project. In fact, you may possibly need support from your sponsor or the steering group. When we talk about roles and responsibilities in a different podcast, we said sponsors, senior management in the arbitrate, they support you managing key stakeholders. So these are probably one of the examples of stakeholders where we really need a senior management team to help us to avoid them becoming a risk for the project.
Absolutely. And conversely then, what do we do when we've identified stakeholders but they've come out as low power and low interest on the project? Do we need to engage with them at all?
Probably very little. I wouldn't say we ignore them, but maybe just keep them in the loop. Maybe just a general newsletter. So for example, if they're building a new school in the area and you just may want to send some information to other stakeholders that are low interest and power, but really you need to make sure where the effort goes. And this type of example, you probably put very little effort in trying to engage them.
Okay, that makes sense. So first learning objective then was about that stakeholder analysis, analysing power, influence, negative, positive, and then identifying who our key stakeholders are so that we engage with them and influence them quite strongly across the project. So the second learning outcome then is understanding the relationship between doing that stakeholder analysis and developing an effective communication plan. So what do? We've analysed our stakeholders. How do we go about creating a communication plan based on that information?
So now we have done the analysis. Now we know what level of engagement we need from them. The next step is to document that information in a communications management plan. Some organizations use a stakeholder management plan or communication management plan. Is essentially the output of that analysis. And in this plan, which is a component of the project management plan, the project manager will write down who the project needs to communicate with based on that analysis, or maybe the ones that we don't want to communicate with. What communication, what information needs to be conveyed, how do we want to do that? Because there are different ways to convey information. Is it going to be a regular report? Is it going to be face-to-face meetings? Is it going to be email update every week, like a progress update? Well, I talk about the frequency when I said every week, the when, how often do we need to communicate? How much? Are there any costs associated to that communication? If we said we need to have you and I rules, a meeting every month, We may have to book a meeting room. There will be some travel expenses.
If we're doing community engagement events, we might actually need to involve professional conferencing facilities and things like that. So there can be some significant costs involved in doing this.
Yeah, that's right. And if the project manager doesn't account for that in the budget, then it will come to a surprise later. You may even want to put as well how the feedback will be collected, because this plan is not in stone. If this is not working, if we're not getting the engagement that we need, we may need to revise. So the communication plan will also say, how are we going to get that feedback?
That's really important. We've got to remember that communication is a two-way process. It's not just about us sending information about the project. It's got to be received, and received in the way that it was intended to be received. And we really need to monitor whether this communication is having the desired effect. Is it influencing? Is it engaging our stakeholders in the right way? Are those negative opinions turning to be more positive throughout the project? So for me, this is very much an iterative process that we start as part of the project management plan, but we really do need to keep an eye on it throughout the project to make sure it's having the right effect.
That's right. Communication is usually one of the common causes of project failure, and it's not because of lack of communication. Is because the communication is not being gauged or tailored. Because if you don't use the right type of communication, if you don't do the right frequency or when it's required, you're not going to get the stakeholder engaged. And sometimes you need to engage them at the start. For example, key stakeholder, they're going to help you defining requirements, they're going to help you identifying benefits. If you don't engage them in the right way, then that could easily cause issues later on in the project.
It's important as well to think about who is going to do the communication. Sometimes there's the assumption that, this is going to be the project manager, this is going to be the project sponsor, but sometimes they're not the right people to send those messages. I worked on a project that was refurbishing a school, and all the communication up front had been done by the project sponsor. There was a lot of local opposition to the disruption this was going to cause. And so they ran an event where they actually got some of the school children to speak. And after that, people really understood why this was so important, and a lot of that opposition melted away. And it was really just by changing the people who were communicating, not the message, nothing else. It was just who was going to do that.
Yeah, I like that example, and it's a really good example of how the communication plan sometimes may have to adapt, or the other way around.
Okay, so it seems as if this is quite a lot of work to do, starting with the stakeholder identification and analysis, and then drawing all of that up into a communication plan and keeping on top of it, etc. What are the benefits of doing this?
100%. So if we don't really spend the time to think about that very carefully, then we may miss some of the stakeholder needs. We may miss the requirements for the project. If we don't use the appropriate communication method or channel, people may miss some important communication. You could even end up having conflict. There may be misunderstandings that could easily cause some friction in the stakeholders. And also, back to your point on roles and responsibilities, it gives clarity. It provides a clear way to understand who has a role and who is going to be communicating what. So really helpful for identifying responsibilities for that communication.
Absolutely. Clarity of message and clarity of approach to communication is so important on the project. Going back to when I said, this seems like an awful lot of work. If you've got a communication plan, actually it helps you be more effective and efficient with your communication. So actually it streamlines the work that you're going to do. It's a more systematic approach. So maybe you can identify stakeholders that have got similar interests that you can communicate to together rather than doing it all separately. So it actually can help you do it in a more streamlined way as well.
And if you think about it, the more work you do at the front, the easier will be later on, because it takes more effort to address issues caused by miscommunication.
If we don't do this proactively, we end up with quite a lot of work to deal with afterwards anyway. So that's the benefits of a communication plan. Let's take this out a little bit wider then. The learning outcomes is understanding the importance of managing stakeholder expectations to the success of the entire project. So how important is it to manage stakeholder expectations?
It's very important. Let's think about about all our stakeholders, we have people like your users, you have team members, you may have external suppliers. Sometimes people don't think about other areas of the business, but finance, for example, we have a podcast about budgeting and cost control, is a key stakeholder. You need to work with them. So if you think about all these stakeholders and you don't manage them correctly, you are going to miss things like benefits, you're going to miss risk, you're not really going to understand the requirements of the users. You will deliver something that in your view is good, but then the stakeholders or users said, well, this is not what we wanted. Let's say you have a stakeholder that is against your project. If you have a pressure group that could really affect the progress, not managing their expectation is really going to stop that stakeholder group to really be
Absolutely.
supportive.
We can think of lots of examples of those big projects in the press where there's been pressure groups, activists, etc., that are really against the project. And it has caused incredible delays and increases in costs. And you wonder whether if they'd have been more proactive about stakeholder management, whether they could have minimized that.
Yes, exactly. Because of that, is really important and it requires a lot of work and sometimes is underestimated. Another good example is if you talk to people like users again about the benefits to a wider business. You're doing a new IT system and you may have a department that is really against that new IT system. We don't want to change it. We've been doing this for ages and that could really hinder your project. But getting other stakeholders that are supportive to the project and could say, no, these are the benefits, may help sometimes reinforcing decision to progress with the project, especially if the project is encounter any issues. If you have stakeholders that really champion the project, they are really going to be the ones that are going to get the project going and could help the ones against the project to be positive. So these ones that will be recipients maybe of your products in the example of the IT system could really change their view. It's one of those things that takes a lot of time, but is so key for the project success.
Again, relating it back to another podcast that we were talking about risks. There is that risk of resistance to change on every project. Stakeholder management is managing that risk of the resistance to change. So it's pretty fundamental. Going back to communication then, seeing that we can see that this is important to the success of our project. What sort of communication methods are available to us? And what do we need to do to tailor messages to stakeholder requirements?
So there are so many different types of communication and different communication methods. You could have written communication, you could have more formal, like a report or an email. More informal communication could be face-to-face as well. And each of them have advantages and disadvantages.
I try to encourage projects to be really innovative when it comes to communication methods. I've seen a lot of really good stuff where, for example, we're trying to get people to understand what the impact of a new site might be or a new IT system, that they do things with virtual reality headsets or models or prototypes or videos and mock-ups and all sorts of things that really communicates through visuals rather than words. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that you can do here.
Yeah, and a good example we could talk about is our training. Sometimes when you do training face to face, you see the body language, you see their expression. They may already, with the body language and their expression, already tell you if they have a question or not. Or when you go to a project meeting and you report your progress, if there is any issues, you could see sometimes people's eyes lighting up.
Absolutely.
So body language sometimes can tell you much more than words.
That's a great example.
We also said people may not always base in the same location, so we need to develop different ways to ensure good communication. So you may have to do virtual meetings, you may have to email. Absolutely. It's important to choose the right way.
That takes us then to the importance of tailoring that messaging to meet different stakeholders. So how can we do that?
So the most important thing is to understand their needs. So for example, if you have someone that is not based in the same time zone, you may want to use a written communication with that person because obviously it's not gonna be capable to join the meeting. If you have, for example, somewhere where you just want to have more informal communication, you may just send a text message, give a call. Sometimes people have WhatsApp groups these days. Microsoft Teams is great. You could have Teams channels and Teams groups. So
That enables you to be really responsive then, and it makes the communication seem more personal.
yes. So it all links back again to the stakeholder analysis.
Yeah.
Doing that thorough analysis of the stakeholders will help to decide what's the most appropriate way to communicate and understand also the audience. Is it one person? Is it one-to-one communication? Or are you
Absolutely.
communicating with a group of hundreds or thousands of people? The communication method may be different to just communication with your sponsor.
Our final learning outcome is to know the factors that can positively or negatively affect communication. So first of all, what factors can positively affect communication?
Positively, technology. In fact, technology could be positive or negative. So technology affects you positively because it allows to bring people together from different locations, but it could be negative as well because, for example, if you and I are having a meeting and you don't have Microsoft Teams, you
Yeah.
may not be familiar with that
Yes.
technology. Or if your internet goes down,
Yeah.
then you may have issues with communication. So technology could be both.
Yeah.
Positive and negative. Environment again could be positive. If you and I book a meeting room, quiet, we keep the focus, we could go through our project meeting. But it could be negative if someone is doing building work outside. When it's gonna really disturb you. So the environment is very important, could affect both positively and negatively.
Okay, what else?
Different backgrounds, different cultures. People may all speak English as a first or second language, but maybe the way you communicate is differently. If you have a meeting in some countries, you may just crack on, go to the agenda. But in other countries, you may want to do a bit of an icebreaker, maybe grab a coffee, talk about personal stuff. You know, some people will start sharp on time. We have a reputation in Spanish people. We relax, take time, maybe go for a big lunch after the meeting. So the project manager needs to understand the cultural differences as well when choosing and tailoring communication methods.
Yeah.
Maybe perception.
Tell me a bit more about that.
Perception. So we'll be biased whether we want to agree or not, but maybe the perception to the person that is doing the communication. Your example of the school is fantastic. You may perceive children doing that differently from, I don't know, politician or sponsor.
That's really interesting.
So we need to really be aware of conscious and unconscious biases.
That makes sense.
Adapting as well the message. So if you're reporting to the board, you may not want to go into a lot of detail, very technical language. If you're reporting to a client, you're not going to use acronyms that only people in your organization understands. All organizations have lots of acronyms that maybe outside their world doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So again, so important to get it right for the success of the project.
I think if you don't, there is that risk that you could turn a more neutral stakeholder into somebody that actually has a negative opinion of the project. So we do have to be really careful about how we do that communication.
Yes, totally.
Well, I think that we've covered all of these learning outcomes. We've identified who our stakeholders actually are, analysed them so that we understand who we need to engage with. We've looked at the relationship between doing that stakeholder analysis and then making an effective communication plan, and discussed how important it is both to manage and engage our stakeholders and manage their expectations, and to have a communication plan and to implement that plan. And then we've talked about lots of different communication methods, things that we've got to think about, tailoring our message, and the factors that can affect communication both positively or negatively. Lots of good information in there. Thanks ever so much, Carmen, for participating.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.